worship, don't you? Woo! That was a resounding yes. Wow. Hey, before we get going off on our second week of Proverbs about how to foolproof your life, somebody had mentioned to me before about being able to take notes. I want to remind you that there are notebooks in the back, pens, also the breakdown for the book back there that I built for you. And today I have another thing that I hope I can begin to offer you each and every week. So if you would like to kind of follow along with notes, you can grab one of these and write down, do it in your notebook too. So we'll start these along. I'm sorry that I don't have a better system other than to hand it out individually this morning, but we'll work on that moving forward. So if you would like to just kind of keep up from there, we would love for you to do that. And you can make some notes along the way, and maybe we can hopefully kind of follow along together as we journey through the book of Proverbs. Remember last week we started by talking about that the book of Proverbs is written for a real clear and specific purpose, and Solomon gives us an indication on the front end exactly what his purpose is. So if you flip to the book of Proverbs this morning, you'll remember from last week we started off by pointing out quickly that the book of Proverbs, he says in verse 2, chapter 1, verse 2, is to learn. Wise counsel. Some of yours will say to know wisdom and instruction. We talked about last week, for reasons that you can't see in the English, but you can see in the original language, in the Hebrew, that what Solomon is writing about, these are words that refer to morality. The word that is translated in English as instruction is a word that talks about moral principles. And by way of connection, the learning not just wisdom but instruction. Wisdom is talking about everyday moral life skills. So living and leading a moral life. And then we riffed a little bit last week around this notion of fear that's in the end of verse 7. And today, as promised, this second one in our journey is aimed at younger folks. So not that parents and older folks can't participate. There's something in here for you too. But younger folks, I think the Lord kind of had you guys in mind when we wrote this. And so as you'll see from your notes, here's our foolproofing tip of the day as we get started. Right? Our foolproofing tip of the day is, and it comes from what we're going to study, is that moral authority grows when moral failure is avoided. So if you want your moral authority in life to grow, it's what Solomon is writing about today, and we're going to see in this particular verse that you've got on your handout there. It starts in verse 8 and 9. Solomon says, "Hear, my child, your father's instructions, and do not reject your mother's teaching, for they are a fair garland for your head and chains for your neck." Now, it's not chains like shackles. I want to make that one clear, right? So what he says is, in terms of the instruction that your parents give, are really meant to be, well, let me say it this way. The instructions, young folks, or all folks, that your parents give, if you follow them and live according to the way that they set forward for you, at least as Solomon thought, then you basically get your Mr. T starter kit. Right? Your moral authority, your character is hanging around your neck like Mr. T's bling or one of your favorite NFL player. Right? You're going around, and it's this symbol that people in public, that everywhere you encounter, can look at you and see and go, you know what? She is a person of moral character. He is a cat that has got it together when it comes to moral skill and moral principle. That's the whole point of parents teaching us and giving us and admonishing us, at least according to Solomon, and it's the part I highlighted for you, is to teach you moral principles and skills, but at the end of the day, just so you don't lose it, it's in bold print, no one in your life, and nobody ever told me this, but no one in your life wants life for you more than the two people that the author of life used to give life to you. Not one person in the world wants life more for you than the two people that the author of life gave life to you through. Nobody. Not one person. No one anywhere wants that more for you. And Solomon suggests that the way to life through all of this is through moral skill and instruction. And so let's back into the first point there, is that if somebody in this room, if somebody gave birth to you, then you have, if you're filling in the blank, you have one job to do. That's the fill in the blank. If someone gave birth to you, you got one job to do. And if you want to know what the one job is, ready, young folks? Comes from Exodus chapter 20. Honor your father and mother. If someone gave birth to you, you got one job to do, and that one job is as simple as we can make it, is to honor your father and mother. And you'll know that one if most of you have been around the church for a while. It comes from the Ten Commandments, and we might not always agree on the power and the validity of the Ten Commandments in society. But I think we can all agree, whether you're a Christian or whether you're not a Christian, that you can read the Ten Commandments from Exodus chapter 20, and you can agree that even if you don't believe in the God of the Bible, those are just good principles to order your life by. As an example, we say, maybe I don't know the Ten Commandments. One of them is don't kill people. Now, I don't know how far. I mean, I'm in the process of being sanctified. I'm not there yet, and I do struggle when I'm in the food line, or when I'm in long lines, or when I'm in lines where people don't seem to have all their stuff together when they get to the window. I struggle, and the devil attacks me there, right? All right? I confess with you. But it never crosses my mind, even though, okay, that's not true. Sometimes it crosses my mind. I study on ways to kill people, right? But the whole Ten Commandments, no matter what you do, no matter where you struggle, you and I can basically agree that lying is just not helpful. Don't bear false witness. You and I can basically agree that adultery is bad. Like you don't have to pray to the God of the Bible to agree, I don't think, that not taking a day off is not helpful. And so there's these basic principles, no matter whether you believe in Jesus or not, that your folks, not to get a far field here, that what Solomon is suggesting is if you'll pay attention to my instructions and to your mother's admonishment, that you will have life. In other words, what they're suggesting is there's these basic things in life that they're trying to teach you, and whether they know it or not, listen to me, young folks. Whether your folks know it or not, they are instilling some level of morality in you. Whether they operate according to the principles outlined in Scripture or whether they don't. They're instilling some level of moral principles in you. And they all somewhere connected to these basic 10 that we talk about in Exodus. And so, of all things you wonder, well, what am I supposed to do? Because my folks sometimes don't get it. They didn't grow up in the world that I grew up in. Listen, no matter what they offer you, no matter how lame it sounds, no matter how restrictive, like a chain, like handcuffs, it might appear to be, don't lose sight of this particular fact, and it's a spin-off of what Solomon's talking about in honoring your mother and father's instruction. In all things, you got to remember that if somebody gave birth to you, you got one job to do, and that job is to honor your father and mother. Always. And you say, yeah, but you don't know my folks. Fair enough. and you don't know mine. And at the end of the day, it's like there's a tension in that instruction, isn't it? There's a tension in the instruction, and then the implicit tension in the instruction is that you don't know my folks. They don't follow the rules that they set for me. They encourage me sometimes to don't do like I do, but do like I say do. Now, parents, this one's for us. It's, well, let's just leave it at this. You always got to come to grips with the duplicity in your own life, right? Duplicity being doubleness. Don't cuss people out, but then you're not waving with all the fingers on your hand in traffic and your kids are in the car. We always have to deal with that. And so implicit, whenever we hear, we have to honor our mother and father. Implicit, I've discovered in their minds is this second point that's on your handout there, and it is this, is that it's hard to respect somebody when they're not entirely respectable. Like this is, if I run into anything among younger folks, this is the one I get pushed back on the most. You say, yeah, you're supposed to, the Bible says I'm supposed to honor my mother and father, but I live with them. I see that. Well, that still doesn't let you out of the trap, though, because other than Jesus, folks, let me say this, other than Jesus, there's not anybody in the world that is free from brokenness. Even your folks. Even your folks. There's nobody in the world that's free from brokenness whatsoever. In fact, all you got to do is read Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, and it's the beauty of Jesus that we don't have a high priest that can't sympathize with our weaknesses, with your folks' weaknesses. They recognize that they get tangled up, but Jesus didn't get tangled up. For our high priest is without sin and free from blemish. That way you can come before the throne of mercy and grace of God for all those who trust in Jesus. But, listen, we get back to the same thing before. Our children experience, and those of you who live in the house say, hey, I did too, our children experience our, let's just call them what they are, parents, our moral failures, and they decide to be disrespectful sometimes. They see how how we blew it, and they decided, well, you know, if that's the model, then it's okay for me to do that. Or, young folks, let me jump back to you. This one maybe is yours. Maybe you live with somebody that clearly didn't model a level of moral living to the point that you wanted to follow, and you took the Fleetwood Mac approach to life. Your parents know this. You might not. But the song kind of goes, you'll go your own way. You took the Fleetwood Mac approach. You figure, if that's the approach for life, then I'm just going to go my own way. And let me offer this one to you this morning as it relates to what Solomon encourages young folks to do. Pay attention to our instructions and to our admonishment, is that you're never going to be honorable by being just different, equally dishonorable in a different way. In other words, if your parents didn't live and don't live in such a way that is very, quote, moral, even in your own eyes, and you decide that you're going to not pay any attention to them whatsoever, you're not at all going to be honorable by just simply being dishonorable in a different way than they are. You're just not. And in fact, what I've learned about you younger folks, the 20-somethings particularly, is that you guys can sniff out hypocrisy from a mile away. I mean, you can look at a cat like me, and you don't even hear a word that comes out of my mouth, and you can spot any hypocrisy in me just by the way my shoulders hang. You guys are magnificent. You've been marketed to more than any other group of people in the history of the world. You can spot fake, phony, and foolish just like that. You can. But here's my point. Is that when you're dishonorable in a different way than you say other people are dishonorable, you're actually living in the hypocrisy that you say you don't appreciate. And at the end of the day, don't lose sight of this thing. I get it. I really do. I get it. It is hard to respect someone when they're not entirely respectable, but you and I aren't going to be entirely respectable either by being unrespectable. And this is why Solomon encourages us once again to follow our parents' wisdom and instruction, their guidance. Because there's something good in there somewhere, believe it or not. I want to jump with you real quick. And it won't be on the screen, but if you got your Bible, as we keep following our points along here, Solomon's encouragement for us is to follow our parents' wisdom and instruction. And we've talked about kind of some tense pieces in there. But at the end of the day, if you recognize that your folks got problems too, and I know that you do, because you got friends that you communicate the problems to about your folks. But if you recognize that, I still want you to press on something here. It's the third place that we're going to land in our notes this morning is that please, even if your folks, those people, those mentors, whether they're adopted parents or biological parents, whatever they are, please at least give them the space to teach you something. And the third point is at least give them the space where you can absorb the words of the wounded healers in your life. Absorb the words of the wounded healers in your life. We're going to jump to chapter 4 this morning because Solomon does this great thing that if you're not careful you could miss in reading the book of Proverbs. Chapter 4, beginning in the first verse, he says this way, "Listen, children." Now all of a sudden, see, it was singular there. Now all of a sudden he broadens it out and makes it plural. So he's speaking to all of us at this point. He says, "Listen, children, to a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight. For I give you good precepts," or good principles to live by. "Do not forsake my teaching." Now here's where you miss if you're not careful. "When I was a son with my father, tender," or in other words, young, "and my mother's favorite," that's what I've been telling my brother for years. Y'all are awake, aren't you? You sure? "And my mother's favorite, he taught me," he being my father, "and said to me," and then you can follow the rest of chapter 4. Now, if you know anything, and here's why this point is so powerful in my mind, about absorbing the words of a wounded healer. If you know anything about Solomon, or been around the church any, you'll know that Solomon's dad was David. Right? And David was, people like me like to throw this word around about David all the time. We like to throw this around and remind you that David was, as God said, a man after my own heart. Not godly like God, but God's articulating that David would forsake everything to pursue God's heart. And if you know anything about David, God blessed him like stupid blessed him. Unbelievable blessed him. And then it came in the springtime of the year when kings would go off to war, Scripture says, to expand his territory. And David decided that, you know what? If God blesses me anymore, I'm as blessed as I can be, and therefore I'm going to start running my life. And he's out on the roof of his palace one day, surveying his kingdom, and what does he see? But a good-looking woman right over there behind the trees. And if you know anything about David's story, is that David ventured off and forsook everything that he knew to be right and threw away the blessing and favor of God in a moral failure. An utter catastrophe. And I don't know that this is true. When Solomon is writing this, talking about when he was young, his dad took him, put him on his knee. Maybe some of you had the same thing happen. But I want to believe in my mind, and I don't know if he did it or not, but I want to believe in my mind that when David is teaching these moral precepts and principles to Solomon, somewhere in the wording, he says, and you know what? Don't trade your birthright for a bowl of stew. Don't give away the stupid blessing that God's going to pour out into your life if you'll stay right in his moral teaching and principles. Don't give that away in a moment of weakness and moral failure. Now, clearly, I don't know that he said that. But I want to think, now, parents, doesn't that make sense to you? Doesn't that make sense that if you had an absolute blow-up in your life, that you would take little Johnny and little Bobby on your knee and at some point teach them that a moral failure will absolutely, as Warren Buffett says, it'll take you 25 years to build a reputation. It'll take you all of 5 minutes to tear it down. Wouldn't you take your kids on your knee and teach them that? I just got to believe that David did that somewhere. But maybe David didn't. Because here's the thing that happens whenever you have moral failure in life. And young folks, you won't see any heads nodding on this one, I bet. But here's the thing that happens when you have moral failure in your life. You're never really the same. And we're going to get to that one in a minute. And so I got to believe that David is teaching, or at least I hope that he gave that to Solomon. But to what end did it work? Because if you know anything about Solomon's story, Solomon's the wisest, the smartest guy ever. He was so smart that even other smart people came to get smarter. And they even paid him to learn from him. There's a trick you can learn for a business. And had just ridiculous blessing from God. Oversaw the unity of God's kingdom. And then what happens? He took and had a moral failure. And he was never the same again. And so if you're not careful, you'll miss this particular point that's here, is that you can look at Solomon and go, you know what? Or like your parents, you go, they don't live by the same rules that they teach. I promise you, friends, your parents are teaching you out of a place like I think Solomon writes these words. He teaches of a place of being a wounded healer. And my admonishment to you is this. Solomon's admonishment to you is this. Absorb the words of the wounded healers in your life. Because there's no perfect people anywhere that you're going to find. And Solomon was smart enough to say, you know what? My dad taught me that moral failures absolutely will wreck your life. And you know how far that went? 0. Because I had a moral failure, and it absolutely wrecked my life. And now Solomon continues to teach to the entire literate world exactly what his dad taught, exactly what he's trying to teach. And I imagine it's what's been handed down even from the beginning of time, or at least from the 10 Commandments. That moral failures they produce pain at best and death at their worst. Why would you stick with the teaching of your mother and father, friends? Is because sometimes mothers and fathers aren't necessarily comfortable telling you that they got moral failures in their life. And hey, I'm not saying that everybody who's got a moral failure in life has got some affair hit out like David or like Solomon. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I am suggesting is that every person that teaches you that is honest teaches from a perspective of having moral failures somewhere in their life. Every single person, including this one with his mouth open right now. Every single person that teaches you and gives you instruction from a position of being a wounded healer. Some of them more healed after the fact than others, by the way. And this is why, young folks, again, this is why your parents teach the way they do. This is why they harp the way they do. This is why they ask you to focus and pay attention the way they do. Because somewhere deep down, as Mr. Nicholson said, deep down in places that they don't like to talk about at parties, they got skeletons buried in the closet. And the teaching and the admonishment is just this. Pay attention to what I'm teaching you, because there's your next fill in the blank, and I've already alluded to it. You never fully recover from moral failures. And the only way to do this is why kind of our focus today, right, is that your moral authority will grow when you learn to avoid moral failures. And most of them are really avoidable. This is why your folks harp and focus and teach. Those of you who have folks that harp and focus and teach on these things. Because some don't. And parents, this is back to you. I don't think it's any of you here, but if you know some, like, let me just be as straight up and honest and real with you as I can. If you give me your kids to teach my moral principles and skills too, I will do that. But don't make your kids have to come to me to find moral skills and principles because they can't find them at home. Because I promise you, I'll teach them. But it's much better off if you'll teach them. Because God gave them to you to steward, you to shepherd, not to me. But all of us have places in our lives where we've given up good wisdom, moral instruction, and teaching, and we've got some moral failure. I'm convinced you can read David's story. David never fully recovered from a moral failure. Solomon never fully recovered from a moral failure. Friends, your folks, including me, we never really recover from moral failure because it alters the way you see the world. That's what sin does. Something dies every time moral failure occurs in life. Something does. And every bit of teaching on the other side of sinful behavior is filtered through that. So lots of times when they tell you, don't hang out on the corner with those bad folk down there, it's because they had some time down on the corner with them bad folk down there. And it's about a rap sheet that you don't know nothing about. It's yeah, for real. I know some of you think my parents been arrested. Probably. It's about experimenting with something that got them into a place that they gave away their birthright for a bowl of stew, and they don't want to tell you. But they're teaching you like they're telling it to you, except you just got to figure out, you remember, sometimes there's a message underneath the message. Remember he said it last week in verse 6? Sometimes they're trying to teach you something, but they just don't want to come out and be authentic, transparent, and vulnerable with you because they're afraid of how you'll see them, and they just miss the fact that you already see them that way anyway. There's a message underneath the message, and it's always filtered through moral brokenness, friends. And so be careful, because once you have a moral failure, this is what our folks are trying to teach us, is that you never fully recover. And here's the thing I want you to write down under point number 4. Your influence. This is why your folks do what they do and say what they say, no matter if they're followers of Jesus or not. Your influence and impact will be far greater in life when your moral authority remains intact. Your influence and impact in life will be far greater when your moral authority remains intact. Now, if they would have just started this whole game by saying that, I probably wouldn't have got it, but I probably would have paid attention. Forgive us, we pray. This is why your folks are doing. This is why they ask you to follow these basic skills and principles of morality, is because your moral influence will be far greater when your moral authority is intact. And let me circle back to what I said. No one in your life wants life for you more than the two people the author of life used to give life to you. No one. No one. No one. This is why they want your moral authority to stay intact and why they teach you. But again, I know some of you can't move off the point that we had in number 2 is it's hard to respect some people sometimes, even my folks, when they're not entirely respectable. Let me finish up our time today with point number 5. Don't discount moral teaching just because it comes from somebody with moral failure. Don't discount moral teaching just because it comes from somebody with moral failure. Because listen, all of us got them. And if you don't, then you're entirely sanctified, but you still have moral failures. So we'll throw that one away. If you don't have moral failures, then you must be Jesus. All of us got them. And if we got them, that's the whole point of Jesus. He sort of recognized that we got a problem with coloring him in the lines. We got a problem just following what our parents teach us in good wisdom and good life skills, good moral authority. We have a real issue with that because our propensity is to, again, live by the Fleetwood Mac approach of life and just go our own way. And if I know anything about my own way, and I hope your way ain't like mine, but if I know anything about my own way, it generally lands me in trouble. It genuinely lands me with some level of moral failure. If you lead me to my own device, it genuinely leads me to some kind of moral failure. And so what are you supposed to do, parents-wise? Like, what are you supposed to do now that we've pulled the scab off and revealed our big secrets to the world as if they didn't already know? Like, how are you supposed to continue to teach, grandparents too, this goes for you, how are you supposed to teach your kids, your grandkids, the next generation when you know you teach from a perspective of a wounded healer? When you got moral failures, like, how are you supposed to maintain credibility when all of us know that there's stuff that, again, you'd rather not have had been true in your life? Well, this kind of goes for everybody, but I assigned it to parents. If you're teaching from a wounded healer perspective, you got moral failures in your life, do this for me. 2 basic things. Number 1, find Jesus. If you want to know how to continue to move forward and teach your kids, your grandkids, those co-workers that you work with, young men and women who need guidance, find Jesus. And number 2, follow him out. Just find Jesus and follow him out. Because he will never steer you wrong out of how to get out of a moral failure. And here's what he's probably going to ask you. You might want to write these 2 down. Number 1, he's going to ask you to ask for forgiveness. Oh, you mean I got to talk to him? And number 2, he's going to ask you to make amends. Now, in the recovery world, we talk about you make amends with everybody you can, except when to do so would harm you and others. Now, let me unspin that one quickly this morning. Anytime exposing a moral failure about you to somebody else, we'll always filter it through, well, that's going to harm me. So, it's going to harm others because they're ignorant that even happened in my life. You can't follow Jesus out of it when he tells you to make amends, and you got to own up to it. You got to make a choice. You'll either just be wounded the rest of your life, or you'll become a wounded healer. You choose. You choose. So find Jesus and follow him out of it, and that kind of goes for all of us. And at all times, right, there's always an appropriate level of transparency. There's always being authentic. There's always times where, you just have to be vulnerable with it because it's what it is, man. But moral failures don't have to define you, folks, as long as we can do those particular things. Now, young folks, this one sort of circles back, and we'll wind our time up like this. You're learning, I'm learning, we're all learning from what I hope are wounded healers. Could be wounded people, but we're still learning. Particularly from your folks, because that's the instruction and encouragement from Solomon today, is listen to my teaching, my admonishment from your parents. Young folks, I only want to remind you, whether they're wounded or whether they're wounded healers, honor your mother and father. Honor your mother and father. Even if they're scoundrels and they're just wounded, find something good about them somewhere. I promise you that if they do anything good, it is not inherent evidence that they are good and that you missed it. It is evidence of the grace of God to work through the worst people on the planet sometimes, and he will do his best to reach them too. And he might be using you to say, you know what, Mom? I don't agree with all that. But the way you love my kid, that's right on. You know what, Dad? I pretty much hate the way you did our whole family. But when you call me and you say hi to me and you support me, that's right on. Like, you can encourage even the broken people in your life, friends, because Jesus is transforming the brokenness in your life into doing something miraculous. And sometimes we want him to do it miraculous in our life. Sometimes he heals the brokenness and uses the miraculous in somebody else's life through us. So again, in all things, honor your mother and father. And here's 4 little bullets I want you to write under number 5. Number 1, always consider your mother and father's instruction. And by consideration, here's what I mean, and it's consistent with what Solomon's teaching us from the first 4 or 5 verses in this chapter. Learn to discern the to-dos in your parents' instructions from the to-don'ts in your parents' instructions. Because I promise you, there's as many don't do's as there are do's in there. Sometimes there's a message under the message, and I'll leave that with you. So learn to discern the to-dos and the don't to-dos, or not do's, if you will. Always consider your parents' instructions. Second one, guard your heart. Guard your heart. And this one gets closer to those who have just wounded folks teaching them in their lives and not wounded healers teaching them in their lives. Sometimes wounded people want to take their dysfunction and work that out through you. You always got to guard your heart, even if it's from your mama or daddy, and not let their dysfunction become your dysfunction. Always guard your heart, because this is not, when they're teaching you moral instruction and wisdom, it's not just about this, but we're talking about growing in mind and emotional readiness in the world. Always guard your heart. And don't let their dysfunction become your dysfunction. Conversely, if your folks are wounded healers, They are, and I hope they are. Don't turn judgmental when they're honest with you. They tell you something you didn't know. They're trying to be authentic, vulnerable, and transparent. Don't climb up on the high horse in the ivory tower and think you can assign judgment. Guard your heart. Third one, check your bearing. Always check your bearing. And your bearing, my bearing, our bearing should always be pointing at Jesus. And if their moral instruction points you in any other way, you always got to pump the brakes and ask, hey, am I on the right heading? Always check your heading. Check your bearing. Make sure you're pointed to the author of life and not pointed towards something else that might look like it just satisfies in this life, but really doesn't give life at all. And last one, if you recognize that you're on a different heading, and here it is, make the necessary course corrections. Don't be afraid. I'll probably get emails for this one. Don't be afraid. If the people, your parents in your life, if you make the distinction, determination that they're pointing you in one direction, and that's not toward Jesus, don't be personally afraid to own your own person and make the necessary course correction toward pointing at Jesus, even if that offends them. Because there's a point in time where you got to own you. And as I'm learning right now, it's much later than 12 going on 13, but that's a different story. You got to learn to own you. And this whole thing about foolproofing your life, in part, has to do with course correction. Make the necessary course corrections if you decide that the teaching you're getting isn't pointing you toward Jesus. You need to always err on the side of pointing at Jesus. For he's the one that heals all moral failures. And he's the one that transforms wounded and makes them wounded healers. In fact, he's wounded himself for our moral failures. And he invites you to come alongside, to continue to find him and to follow him out of moral failures in your life. As we prepare to sing this morning, I only say to you that wherever you are, the altar is a great place to find Jesus. Prayer is an even better place to communicate with him. Because the people who gave life to you, they want life for you more than you'll ever know. And if they could have anything for you, it would be that you not have failures that they've had. And this morning, maybe you need to do some business with the Lord. Maybe you need to go back and correct some things that you've been teaching. Maybe you need to go back and say, you know what? I discounted good teaching and wisdom. I was hypocritical, not you. I'm sorry. The altar is a great place to begin to pray, begin to work through that. And to remember that if your parents want life for you, how much more does the author of life want life for you? True life, real life, life that frees us from the past guilt of moral failures begins with salvation in Christ. You can do that today too if you would like. I'd love to pray with you if that's what you need to do, what you want to do. But you can go from just being plain old wounded to being a redeemed son or daughter, being a wounded healer, because the power of Jesus will do that for you. That the author of life wants life for you more than you can ever know. As we sing together this morning.